Hello everybody and welcome back to another week in review, at this time of 26th Guards Infantry suggested by Duke705 and Gruppe A Hardneck suggested a few weeks back by Blickwinkel. This is once again broken up in a weird way, however this is righting the wrongs that I kind of committed last week and kind of trying to set the universe back into motion, so we'll be back into it in chronological order after this week. Also, I'd like to take a brief moment just to say that I'm sorry I haven't been getting a lot of other content onto the channel. These last couple weeks have been a little crazy for me, but it should be calming down here soon, so I should be able to continue posting as per normal. Without further ado though, let's jump into my first iteration of 26th Guard Strokovi. Now lucky for me, I actually got into this deck throughout this week right after they buffed the 85mm cannon. For those of you that don't know, the buff came in a fairly recent patch in which Eugen changed the 85mm cannon to be a large caliber gun and thus have less drop off over range, and that really does help the allies a lot. Coupling this with the earlier change to the T-34-85, and I dare say that the T-34-85 1944 variant might be a very strong contender just because it has a large caliber gun and now APC-R has the same drop off over range as AP. However, that is not what we are here to talk about. In my recon tab in this deck, I brought in a Phase A and a Phase B card of the Snappery. Now, in Phase A, I brought them in the WLA motorbikes as I had some left over that I could spare, and in Phase B, I rounded it out with the M3A1 recon truck, just 15 points for an extra recon unit that also has a machine gun. It's a great time. In the infantry tab, we led things off a little bit light given our V for Victory deployment type. However, we had the Guardia Komroti, the Guardia DP, and the Sturmoviki Rocks. The Sturmoviki Rocks are fantastic units to use in the forest, and honestly, unless you run into Beglite Pioneer, there's not a lot that's going to stop them. However, because of this, they are quite pricey and a little slow to get to the front lines, slower that is than, say, Flamer Squads or your typical Stostrup that you're going to be up against. In Phase B, I brought in the Chernopajachniki, and these guys were just there to kind of give me that extra little bit of human flesh that I could put in front of my units and push forward with. I also brought in my Sturmoviki Rocks in this phase, and this was the latest phase I could bring them in. Being that this was going to be my weak phase, it's a little odd to me even on looking at it now that I had more infantry in the weakest phase than I did in my earlier stronger phase, but you know, mistakes are made. In Phase C, I rounded all out with two cards of the Guardia DP, and these guys were again just there to give me that late game pressure from infantry or hold down flags that I'd taken elsewise, because the Guardia DP, while they're fantastic at fighting infantry, aren't really good at anything else, so that's what I brought them in for. In the tank tab, which ended up being a lot better than I thought it was going to be throughout the week, I brought in the KV-1E in Phase A, 6 per card, 60 points a tank, and these guys are fantastic, as well as the IS-1 using the aforementioned 85mm cannon. Now, I went into this week not knowing that they had buffed the 85mm cannon, and suddenly I watched the IS-1 engage and kill a Tiger at 1500 meters, and immediately thought, well that's not right, usually this thing will just bounce shots helplessly off the front of the Tiger until it eventually dies from artillery. But honest to God, the IS-1 has become a real contender of a heavy tank. I dare say that it earns its 120 point price tag, whereas before I don't think that it did. However, in Phase B, I brought in a card of the T-34Es, these come at a forced 1-star veterancy, else I would have brought them in at no stars, and also my card of KV-85s, which were forced to come in Phase B. The KV-85s using the same gun as the IS-1 also really did stand out this week. They were boxing things that normally they couldn't because of the earlier restrictions, and I found that this tank tab actually became much more robust because of that. In the support tab, I bring in the Ognamachiki in Phase A, fairly standard, coming in the WLA motorbike, a Phase A card of the SG-43 coming in the Jeep, a Phase A card of the OT-34, which is just a T-34 with some flames mounted to the top, and a Phase A Commander to round it all out. In Phase B, I bring in the OB-25 76.2mm, and also a supply truck. If you're looking at this division and you're thinking, where's the ISU-152? Well, I just don't like that unit. I really don't. I understand that it has uses, and I understand that it can and will beat most enemy tanks if it's used properly. However, it has such a propensity toward missing very crucial shots that I find it's oftentimes a waste of however many points I spend to bring it in. On top of that, this support tab is bloated to say the least. The next card would cost me 4 points, then 5, and in order to bring in the 152, I would probably have to drop the card of OB25s, which I found to be more useful, honestly. In the anti-tank tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the PTS 41s, coming in the WLA motorbike, a Phase A card of the M42 45mm, a Phase A card of Ziz 3s, and a Phase B card of Ziz 3s. I round all of this out with the SU-85 coming in Phase B at 1 star. The SU-85 is another huge buff from that recent buff to the 85mm, as well as the previous buff to the APCR, making this thing a very deadly beast at 60 points. On top of that, it has a very generous veterancy curve going from 8 to 6 at 1 star, and so I just felt it was a no-brainer to bring them in like this and keep them near command, as these were oftentimes my only answer to really heavy tanks such as King Tigers. In the anti-air tab, I brought in the ZSU M15 in Phase B and the ZSU M15 in Phase C, just to sort of have the ZSU M15. However, there's really no other option in the AA tab. You could bring in the Maxim or the Dushka, however, I find both of these units to be a complete waste of points, and oftentimes I just end up bringing them in for the memes or sort of as a last-ditch effort to fight infantry. In the artillery tab, I bring in a Phase A card of the Su-76M, a Phase A off-map carrier to help get those early footholds, a Phase B card of the F-22s coming in the supply trucks, a Phase B Arjusha, a Phase C artillery commander, and a Phase C card of the 280mm self-propelled artillery. Now, a quick note for the Su-76s, I wasn't usually using them as artillery pieces. Sometimes I'd use them for their indirect fire just to pick up an artillery piece or a AA gun that I could see on the fronts. However, most of the time I was using these as sort of AT units more than anything else. Almost the same goes for the F-22s, because they do feature a fairly decent AP round, and oftentimes the F-22s aren't really great at anything else, in my hands at least. I'll get into my new undying love for the Arjusha after I show the deck at the end of the week. However, suffice it to say that the 280mm artillery really disappointed me for the points I spent on it. Sure, there's something primal in me that looks at a 280mm piece of artillery and thinks, well, that's the biggest thing that I can bring in this deck, ergo I have to, and ergo it will smash everything that it fires at. However, smash everything that it fires at is something that's true of 85mm artillery, let alone the 280. I found that oftentimes these guys are a waste of points, a waste of supply, and subsequently just die to counter battery almost immediately, being that they're so slow. These things move at the speed of smell, and it's just a little disappointing watching them die after you spent 160 points on them. In the air tab, I bring in the Yak-9s in Phase A to kind of act as my only AA in that phase, a Phase A card of the IL-2 TAC-37, quote, bomber, end quote, a Phase B card of the Yak-9Bs, and a Phase C card of the Yak-9Bs with the medium armaments. I'll get into the IL-2 TAC-37 with the deck at the end of the week. Speaking of the deck at the end of the week, we will jump to that right now. Not a lot of changes actually occur throughout the deck as a whole. I don't change anything in the recon, infantry, or tank tabs, and the support tab, while it did change throughout the week, ended up settling on this, just having dropped the OB-25. I ended up doing this in favor of bringing in more anti-tank weapons, as the biggest, shall we say, detriment to playing this deck is the lack of ability to control tanks on open grounds, just because all of your options are kind of pricey and kind of ineffective in a way. Because of this, I was oftentimes fighting for areas that I couldn't quite control all the way, and so I ended up investing in some more Su-85s, and just kind of getting those Ziz 3s on the front lines more often throughout the week. The artillery tab also saw me dropping the 280mm, as I alluded to, and bringing them in the form of the F-22 in Phase A. These I also used as AT weapons just to sort of help me get through the early phase and into the late phase with my AT support. The air tab saw no change, however, I could see my way into dropping something to a later phase or perhaps dropping the Yak-9s altogether, as I found if I exerted enough pressure, the Yak-9s weren't really worth bringing in, and honest to God, these things barely ever killed anything anyway. Honestly, and I know this was just after the buff, so a lot of people weren't expecting it, but this deck was a lot of fun to play this week, much more fun than any time I've played it in the past. The Recon and Infantry tabs do basically what you'd think they'd do. They're decent enough at everything, they do well enough for a Strokovi deck. However, the true standout units don't come in until the tank tab with the IS-1 and the KV-85. I found that these things being able to reliably box with enemy tanks was a huge difference, and before you say that they were in the past, I really doubt that. The IS-1 was barely capable of killing a Panzer IV at 2 kilometers, let alone something else, even though it was fairly well armored. The support tab in this deck is very, very bloated, and I think that's probably the weakest part of the deck, not in the units that it can bring in, but in how much it costs to bring those units in. The OT-34 is practically a given into this division, and I love having my commanders, so on top of that, that's 3 cards already taken with the supply trucks. I suppose I could have seen my way into dropping the Ognamachiki to perhaps bring up a ISU-152 or perhaps bring back the OB-25s. However, I found that having the ability to get the Ognamachiki up there in the first place and then reinforce those with the Sturmoviki was much more reliable. Throughout the week, the Su-85s really did impress me. Honestly, these units have always been something that I've wanted to use well, however, have never really held up to the point cost that they were at. That's not true anymore. The Su-85 is really, really good now. I was oftentimes putting these things at 1 kilometer engagements with Tigers or the like, and seeing them come out the victor just by toggling their APCR on and off and doubling their fire rate in that way. The AA tab also could use some love in the addition of just 1 stationary gun, even if it's a low caliber one. Just any stationary gun would be fantastic for this deck. However, my true standout in this deck, and I know this is something that people have been preaching about for a very long time, something I've been reluctant to jump on the bandwagon about, but the Arjusha really carried the games for me. Have a problem with a lot of infantry in one spot? Arjusha. Have a problem with a couple King Tigers rolling up on your front? Arjusha. Too much AA? Arjusha. The answer to almost every one of my problems was Arjusha. The only times it wasn't were the times that my enemy was actively moving their things or attacking me, and that was the worst case scenario for me. What's better is you can fire only a partial salvo from the Arjusha, stop it from firing, and then fire somewhere else, assuming that you've killed whatever it was you initially aimed at. In fact, during one of the games that I played, I killed an enemy King Tiger with an Arjusha, stopped it firing, and then aimed at another one, killing that. These things are absolutely amazing, and it's imperative that you keep these alive at any cost. They have to be moved immediately after firing to avoid counter battery, as if you lose this guy, being that I only have the 1 in this division, that's it. You have literally no answer to those same problems ever again. Also, something worth noting about the air tab, the IL-2 TAC-37 is an interesting beast, and I'm sure we've all seen this before. It comes in with the same moniker as a bomber, and it looks like a bomber even in the deployment screen. However, it also packs a gun pod capable of penetrating tank armor. In order to use this gun pod, simply toggle off the bombs and tell it to attack a tank. It'll just preferentially use the gun pod ammo instead of the bombs at this point, and then just toggle the bombs back on provided it's still alive to have it drop that on either the tank that survived your onslaught or on infantry nearby. The huge advantage of this unit is that your enemy is likely to think that it might just be a bomber, just based on the color of the unit while it's coming in, or if they click on it and see bombs on it, they're likely to just think it's a bomber, as I have in the past, even though I've played this game long enough to know better. However, you could theoretically get access to better anti-tank options. I just went with these because they were a bit more versatile and to showcase a mechanic that people might not have known about. I found that the V for Victory deployment type really suited this deck well. That is to say, it didn't do poorly. V for Victory is kind of really dicey. If you're playing against really experienced players, I wouldn't advise using it, honestly. It leads to having such a weak phase B that any experienced player on the opposing team is just going to note that and then push right through you in B when they have a point advantage, most likely. However, I found that throughout the week this wasn't the case for me. During the game that's showing right now, I'm fighting a Maverick division that doesn't know that I'm a V for Victory, I'm fairly certain. He spends most of his time just hiding his units behind his own anti-tank weaponry. However, most of the time I'm on the verge of collapse during Phase B especially. I find that as far as how this deck performs in different player types and different player counts, I find that the more players, the better this deck performs. In a 2v2, it requires a very specific friend in order to push properly, or you might just get shut down. In one of the 2v2s I played throughout the week, I played with another person playing 26th guard, and we had no way to control the open area where a bunch of Panthers were just kind of roaming free with our IS2s, or IS1s, excuse me, being incapable of dealing with them. All in all though, this deck is only unique for having the IS1 and KV85, KV85 now being also in 126th Gornostroki, but aside from that, it's just your typical Russian infantry division. There's not much that separates this from other divisions aside from that tank tab, and so anything that I've said about any of those divisions is going to apply here. The Russian infantry are excellent in their point value, excellent in their efficiency, however not excellent in a 1v1 against German units of the same caliber. There's really no standout units in any tab in this deck other than, say, the tank and the anti-tank tab, and aside from that, you have no way to deal with the open ground that you're oftentimes going to be presented with. If you're going up against a numerosity of Panthers and Tigers, you're going to have a really hard time, honestly. I found that with this division, it was easier to fight King Tiger divisions than it was to fight Tiger divisions, simply because the numerosity of Tigers was so much higher than the King Tigers. I can deal with one heavy tank in one spot, however 3 heavy tanks in 3 different spots is a whole different ballgame, and it requires a much more micro for me to deal with in this division. I would say though that this deck is still moderately difficult to play, and the reason I would levy that upon this deck is because it does require some micro in the current meta of the game. The Su-85, in order to really overperform, has to be fire toggled between AP and APCR. Because of this, that adds valuable micro time onto those. On top of all this, the Arjusha is your main method of dealing with super heavy tanks, and because of that, that's just a little bit more micro on top of all that. What's more, if you're running the exact division that I ended up with, the IL-237 requires a little bit of micro in toggling off the bombs and running it in the correct direction to try and get side or back armor on a tank instead of just running it dead on, hoping there's no enemy AA and subsequently shelling the AA if you find it. Either way though, let's hop over to the Axis to Gruppe A Hardneck and my first iteration of that division over there. Now my first iteration of Gruppe was going to be a balanced deployment type, and I led off with the Recon tab thinking I'll grab the Aufklauer because they come in the SPW222 and was quickly proven wrong. That is not the case in this division. However, I ended up grabbing the VK901, and these guys are just excellent at running up with your opening, suppressing enemy infantry, or even capping out a few of them before they're able to unload, and that's really all I needed it for. There were no units in the Recon tab that really screamed to me other than the VK901, however, I could see my way into dropping something else later on in the deck and grabbing something from this tab, say Aufklauer or even Spartrub. Moving on to the infantry tab, I brought in the Hujrak in Phase A. These guys are just a pile of rifles and are fantastic at mid-ranged engagements, however they lack an LMG, and so I also supplemented them sort of Panzer Grenadier coming in the SPW231. I finish out Phase A with the Reiterführer coming in the Kubel Transport. In Phase B I bring in the Ersatztruppen, just at no star veterancy, obviously, as well as in the Opel Blitz munitions truck, 15-point infantry, I can just flood them all over the map. I love Ersatztruppen, I love them to death. I also brought in a Phase B card of the Stastrup, and a Phase B card of the Hujar, and that's a word. These guys are just the same as the Hujrak, however they have 3 LMGs between them, and so they really excel at those mid and long ranged engagements. The biggest worry with these guys is that they run out of ammunition quite quickly on the LMGs, being that there are 3 of them and a limited amount of carrying space among all the units. So these guys oftentimes need a little bit more ammo ported to them, or you just let them die without ammo, and that's perfectly acceptable too. I finish out Phase B with the Right Jaeger MP44, and these guys were just, as stated, just MP44 wielding madmen that sort of cleaned up the mid-ranged engagements that the Stastrup couldn't quite reach with their short-ranged weapons. In Phase C, I round it all out with the Grenadier DP, and these guys are just typical spammable units. At 20 points each, they actually set themselves apart in that they're a little more cost-effective than most of the other units brought in this tab. In the tank tab, I bring in the Panzer T-34-42 in Phase A at no stars, as well as a Phase A card of Tiger Ease. Now, I love the Tiger, I've said it 1,000 times, and the T-34 is an excellent medium tank to accompany the Tiger up or to accompany your infantry into a town. All in all, the Phase A for this division was really nice in the tank tab. In Phase B, I brought in a card of the Stug 3G at no stars, a card of Tiger E Führers at 1 star forced, and in Phase C, I rounded all out with the Tiger E's coming in at no stars. My thoughts behind all of these is, sure, I could get a better veterancy curve on the Stugs and upvet them, and sure, I could bring in the Tigers earlier. However, I just wanted numerosity in my tank tab, as for the areas that I thought I'd be fighting for with Gruppe, I didn't think that I'd be seeing a lot of heavy take resistance, and so the Tigers were just going to be worth their weight in gold. In the support tab, I brought in the Ersatz MG in the Kubel. I brought in a Phase A commander. In Phase B, I brought in the Jaeger MG42, as well as a munitions truck and the Panzer IIIN. All in all, I'm in love with this support tab. It has everything that I need it to have, as well as a lot of it. The Panzer IIIN is one of my favorite support tanks in the game. It fires faster than Sin and still packs an ability to kill vehicles. On top of this, the Ersatz MG are just cheaper MGs that run away when they get shot at. That's literally ideal for what I want in that unit, in that phase. Because you get 8 of them per card in Phase A and they're only 25 points as opposed to the typical 35 points, you can just spam them all over the place and use them as sort of your frontline infantry if you need to, though it's less than advisable. In the anti-tank tab in this division, I bring in the Reitjäger Panzer Schreck. These guys are just your typical Panzer Schreck teams. An M42 in Phase A, as well as a Pak 40 in Phase A. I round out Phase A with the Jagdpanzer 38, then I bring in a card of Phase C Jagdpanzer 38s also. These guys are fantastic. I don't know what else I could say about the Jagdpanzer. It's just a Jagdpanzer, but it also packs a PCR shells. It's absolutely amazing at killing enemy tanks, and at 70 points, I don't think I could ask it to do anything more than it currently does. In the anti-air tab, I had mostly prayers on my side to try and stop the enemy aircraft, but aside from that, I brought in the Flak 38 20mm coming in the SDKFZ 11 Flak. This was just so I could get as many guns on the map in Phase B as possible, and I also brought in the Phase B card of the SDKFZ 7-1. My strategy with the AA in this deck was to hope the enemy didn't know I didn't have any AA and scare off anything that they sent at me with the numerosity of guns rather than the effectiveness of these guns. In the artillery tab, I brought in the 105mm off-map observer, as well as a Phase A card of the FK231F 75mm gun, and I used these guys mainly as infantry support guns on the front lines. However, they do feature a radio, and I brought them in the supply truck. In Phase B, I also bring in the Battery Führer. This was just to sort of supplement my command throughout that Phase B and kind of create a very robust command structure. In the air tab, in Phase A, I bring in the ME-109 Hungarian edition, and these are just 3 per card at 2 stars. I thought they'd be super good, however, they're just too slow to be used effectively as ASF against most allied fighters. In Phase B and C, I bring in just several million bomb chuckers. These guys, the HE-111 H-Tech 16s, were fantastic at doing my typical delete any spot on the map that really disagrees with me and move on. Moving on to my deck at the end of the week, and you'll see I've picked up another card of Phase A Reitjäger MP44s as I lacked really any ability to deal with close quarters infantry in Phase A, which was really a huge oversight. Another thing you're likely to notice is I've swapped this over to a Vanguard division, as I meant to do that in the first place. I was building it as a balanced, I forgot I was going to swap it over to a Vanguard, and then I kind of forgot midway through and started building it weirdly, so we've swapped it all over now, and that's what I meant to happen to begin with. The tank tab saw no change, as well as the support tab. The anti-tank tab saw me dropping the Hetzers from Phase C to Phase B, and me dropping the Reitjäger Panzer Schreck teams altogether, as I found these were kind of redundant, and I'd love to have them, but the anti-tank tab was just so expensive, and I needed the Hetzers more. In the AA tab, I dropped the Phase B card of SDKFZ 7-1s to Phase A to help me with that early AA, as I've also dropped the Hungarian fighters in favor of the ME-410. Now, the ME-410 I can only imagine using in Phase A. Not only because I'm a Vanguard division, but also because the ME-410 is so slow. Any enemy player worth their salt that's using super heavy tanks is just going to bring up an AA truck, and by the time this thing gets there, it's just going to be stunned already. Because of this, my only hope with the ME410 was to get an enemy tank before they had AA on the field, and this was oftentimes not the case. However, it wasn't kind of an all-in situation. I didn't find that I was fighting for areas of the map where Hardneck would encounter a lot of these super heavy tanks, so I just used these on other fronts that were falling apart or struggling, and that's a great way to send help to your allies, is just sending a plane or two, as this is really easy micro, doesn't require a lot of thought, and oftentimes helps a lot. This deck as a Vanguard division really does well. I don't know what I think about it doing in 1v1s, however in 2v2s, 3v3s, it really excels. In 4v4s it has a lot of potential to stall out, as most Vanguard divisions do, just simply because a lot of your early pressure can sometimes be countered by an enemy taking 1 or 2 flags, stopping a double tick, and driving the game on for longer than you need it to be, being that you're playing Vanguard division. Aside from all this, much like 15 Scots from last week, this deck is capable of hitting sort of a critical mass of Tigers and Hetzers and Stugs, sort of arrayed around a town that you're meant to take, or just by using the excellent infantry that comes stock with this division. Honestly, this division was really easy to play. There's not a lot of micro that goes into it. You can fire toggle the APCR on the Jagdpanzer 38T, and you can technically bring things in at higher veterancies and maintain a better command structure that I ended up doing sometimes. However, just being that it's a Vanguard that puts forth a lot of early game pressure with a lot of budget units is more than enough to make it an easy division. If I was going to change anything, I'd likely drop the Stostrup to Phase A, or perhaps the Hujar that are in Phase B to Phase A, because I needed more Phase A infantry in a lot of situations. I think a lot of these were holdovers from the earlier time when I was making a half-balanced, half-Vanguard division, and so I just never ended up swapping this to something that felt truly amazing. All that said, this infantry tab really didn't disappoint me. So long as you used the units to their strength and didn't engage a right Jaeger MP44 with an enemy unit at 750 meters, then you were going to be doing great. If I was to level any complaint on this division, it would be the AA tab. The AA in this division is fine, but it doesn't come in at enough to be as bad as it is. On top of this, you have no real ASF option that is a fantastic pick. You have no FW190 ATAC 8s, no fantastic version of some sort of fight will kill enemy planes. And so because of that, you're left to either rely on allies for your anti-aircraft or sort of just get bombed and deal with that. Honest to God, the latter is what I ended up doing most of the time, as it's just too tricky to try and help an ally micromanage their anti-aircraft guns on your side, so I just took the bombs and kept going, hoping for the best, and oftentimes it worked out. This is obviously a less than ideal strategy, and so if you're someone that relies a lot on not getting bombed to death, then I wouldn't suggest this deck for you. In fact, that's probably the most difficult part of it. If you're unable to exert enough pressure to make sure the enemy is incapable of affording planes and holding their front line, then perhaps this deck is going to be very difficult for you, as if you're going to be building up a push and then trying to strategically implement it rather than blitzkrieging through the lines, you're just going to find yourself getting completely harried by the enemy aircraft. All that aside, I really love any deck that gets access to Tigers and any deck that gets access to MP44s, and this one gets both, so it's fantastic in my book. I had a lot of fun playing this one throughout the week, and for that matter, I had a lot of fun playing 26th also. Either way though, that is going to do it for this week in review. Next week, we have Chicken Nuggy's suggestion of the Finnish Panzer Division, as well as Morskaya Gruppe Baktina on the Allies. If you have any suggestions for this series, be sure to leave them in the comments below, and I'll either get to them in chronological order, or I'll route you to where they already exist in the video titles. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something.